The east coast of Africa has known many different traders. Junks once sailed here all the way from China. Portuguese ships used to call in on the way to India. But above all, it's been the Arabs who have visited this coast. And they came for one trade in particular, slaves. The beach here at Bagamoyo, now part of Tanzania, was the last place the slaves saw on their own continent of Africa. Shackled by the neck, they were brought here from villages in the interior. And before being shipped overseas, they were kept within this compound. Bagamoyo was their lament. Bagamoyo meaning, my heart is broken. In the 19th century, there was a new wave of visitors. Christian Europe became interested in this vast continent full of pagans, just as commercial Europe began to see such rich lands as desirable colonies. It was the missionaries who came first, idealistic young men and women, eagerly setting up here with no defense against Africa's hidden threat, disease. Rest in peace, Brother Hugues, aged 24, Brother Isaac, aged 37, Brother Dionysios, aged 25, and Sister Claire. Christianity was first brought to Bagamoyo by a Catholic order of missionaries, the Holy Ghost Fathers. They came to fight against the slave trade and to educate any freed slaves as Christians. Today, this is not so much a mission station as a normal Catholic parish. A Holy Ghost Father from Holland, Father Fritz, is the parish priest. The first missionary buildings at Bagamoyo still stand. They were built at a time when Africans were causing great interest in Europe, in one form or another. People from undeveloped lands were the focus for every sort of optimism. To them, the industrial countries of Europe would be able to export their religion, their products, and even, to a suitably limited extent, their way of life. Queen Victoria's England had recently given the world an impressive glimpse of its power and wealth in the Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in a vast steel and glass building which well deserved its romantic name, the Crystal Palace. Here was evidence of what a great industrial nation could produce, and of how a great imperial nation could trade, bringing raw materials from the Queen's distant colonies, and then selling the finished products to the Queen's distant subjects. They had every reason to feel satisfied, these respectable English visitors, most of whom worked hard 5 or 6 days a week, and all of whom, it could safely be assumed, attended church devoutly on the Sabbath. Sheffield, a name that gave particular cause for pride. This was the crucible of Britain's new prosperity, the great steel town which built the machines which made the wealth. What devout visitors to the Great Exhibition didn't know, but were soon to hear, was that as far as Christianity was concerned, all was not well in places like Sheffield. For centuries, the Christian church had played a leading part in the life of a largely rural England. But how would it cope with the cities? People flooded in from the villages to find work in the new industrial towns. In a village, everyone had lived near a church, had been on nodding terms with the vicar. But here life was anonymous. The classes lived separately in different parts of the city. The factories provided the wealth of the richer classes, but they preferred, understandably, to live as far as possible from the smoke and the filth, As to the poor who worked in Sheffield's factories, home for them was just round the corner, in a cramped and grimy street. The church had little to offer these people on the seventh day. Church-going became identified more and more with the middle classes, the bosses. And as the cities grew, it became obvious that most districts didn't even have a church. Well, that was dealt with quickly and impressively. A vast number of Methodist chapels were built. And as for the Church of England, between 1820 and 1850, a building was completed every few days. A total of nearly 3,000 new churches. That's a lot of churches. And they were built with the highest hopes. On one particular Sunday, in 1851, the very year of the Great Exhibition, anyone coming to worship in this church at Sheffield, which had then been only recently built, would have noticed something unusual. Standing in the porch was someone with a pencil and pad, counting heads. And it was the same that day in every church and chapel throughout the country. The reason was that the government had commissioned the first ever census of how many people were practicing Christians. And the results, when they were published, caused a sensation. It turned out that 40% of the people had been in church that day. Well, nowadays, the same figure would cause a sensation in the opposite sense. We'd be amazed at so many people going to church. But in Queen Victoria's reign, it seemed a shockingly low figure. And what made it worse, on closer inspection, was that hardly any of those 40% were members of the working classes of the great new cities. Evidently, an entire section of Christian England had slipped out of reach of the church. The man who organized the census said that the new cities clearly needed missionaries, and he announced in resounding terms that people who will not hear the gospel in the church must have it brought to them in their own haunts. His challenge was answered by a few missionaries, but for most, the cities had little appeal. There was nothing romantic about the conditions in which the slaves of the factories struggled to survive. The romance belonged elsewhere. An entire continent, complete with real slaves, caught the imagination of Victorian England. And it was David Livingstone, more than anyone, who inspired the conventional idea of a missionary, that of a brave Christian penetrating not darkest Sheffield, but darkest Africa, and earning a monument in Westminster Abbey by the courageous example of his life and death, a monument inscribed with his own words.
All I can add in my solitude is, may heaven's rich blessing come down on everyone, American, English, or Turk, who will help to heal this open sore of the world.
Cambridge had been the place where Livingstone first fired the conscience of England. He came, in 1857, to speak in the elegant Senate House about what he called the open sore of the world, slavery in Africa. In this hall, he was greeted as the best-selling author of a book about his missionary travels. The Cambridge audience flocked into the Senate House to hear him. But he spoke to them not just as an explorer, he spoke as someone with a crusade to launch. He had been appalled by what he had seen in Africa of the slave trade. Villages being raided, people being hauled off, and in particular parents so poor that they were forced by poverty to sell their children to the Arab traders. Livingstone believed that the trade could be ended by a two-pronged attack, by European merchants taking prosperity into the dark continent, and by European missionaries bringing morality. And that was the crusade that he was here to launch. For Cambridge was eager to be convinced. Slavery, more than any other subject, aroused inspiring feelings of moral outrage. And so the reports say there were resounding cheers from the audience here at Livingstone's closing words.
I beg to direct your attention to Africa. I go back to Africa to try to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Do you carry out the work which I have begun? I leave it with you.
The following year, Cambridge joined with other universities in sending a mission to Central Africa. A party of missionaries set off in the very highest spirits. They even compared themselves to St. Augustine, who so many centuries before had sailed to England to convert the natives. They would do the same for Africa. The mission was headed by a very young bishop, the 35-year-old Charles Mackenzie. The expedition proved a disaster. Mackenzie strode confidently into Africa with his bishop's staff in his left hand and a rifle in his right hand. But the very first sight of a party of 80 captive slaves so enraged the missionaries that they cocked their rifles, routed the Arab slave traders, and freed the victims. It was all most exhilarating, and in no time at all, the young African boys were learning how to march in step to a drum made from an elephant's ear. But the missionaries had no way of supporting their new community, and they knew all too little about African diseases. Within less than 2 years, nearly all the freed slaves had been dispersed. Nearly all the missionaries, including Mackenzie himself, were dead. What remained of the mission was withdrawn to the greater safety of an island off the coast, Zanzibar. Zanzibar stands opposite Bagamoyo, 25 miles off the East African coast. This was the journey that the slaves made on their way to be sold in the last public slave market in the world. The island was ruled by an Arab sultan. These sturdy pillars once sheltered his harem. Zanzibar still has the look of an Arab town. The Sultan didn't feel threatened by the arrival of the missionaries. In fact, he even gave them a present of 5 young slaves and a handsome house on the seashore in which to teach them Christianity. From their windows, the missionaries could watch a horrifying spectacle. Into this harbour came the Arab slave ships, but they stopped just offshore. The reason was that the Sultan charged custom duties on any slave brought into his island. So before landing, the slavers opened their decks and inspected the people who were packed tightly underneath. They threw overboard the dead, and they followed them with the dying, or with anyone so sick that he or she seemed unlikely to fetch a decent price at the market. Now and then, the missionaries even managed to rescue the dying from the sea, just in time to give them a Christian burial. Zanzibar is still mainly Muslim, but the Christian cathedral symbolizes one great victory. It's built on the site of the old slave market. When that was finally closed, with the help of some British gunboats to persuade the Sultan, the missionaries built on the very spot where people had once been sold like cattle. The clergyman in charge here, William Sudi, is himself a link back to those early days. His grandparents were freed slaves. He's even related to one of the first 5 boys given to the missionaries by the Sultan. Around the area where his ancestors were bought and sold, the missionaries built a hospital and a school, and the house in which Sudi, as canon of the cathedral, now lives. In his house are the records of the mission's main activity, educating freed African children in Europe's religion and Europe's idea of good conduct, as the school reports of the time show.
Very good. Writes excellent papers for weekly catechism.
Very quiet and attentive in class and at church, but only knows a little.
Learns a little, is being prepared for confirmation.
This type of Christian education was precisely what the first missionaries had intended to bring to Africa, but it was going on in Zanzibar, an island off the coast. But 100 years ago, Edward Steer, the Bishop of Zanzibar, finally fulfilled Livingstone's original dream, a mission into the highlands of Africa. In 1876, the bishop established an Anglican mission near Masasi. Steer's title was rather grandly Bishop of Central Africa. Well, this place is 100 miles from the coast. Hostile tribes attacked the new settlement, founded for freed slaves. But it survived. Over the years, an increasing number of Africans were taught, in the words of the English hymn, to stand up for Jesus. For this missionary, and for his congregation, this is a special year, a centenary. Outside the Cathedral of Masasi, which itself was built for the 50th anniversary of the mission, an open-air service today commemorates 100 years of planting England's faith in Africa. The service is conducted by Bishop Chisonga, the first African to become Bishop of Masasi. His predecessors have come to join him in celebration. Waiting on the platform is the bishop who handed over to him a few years ago, Trevor Huddleston. Between them stands the priest of this parish, Richard Norgate. He's been a missionary in Africa for his entire adult life, but only recently serving a black bishop. The change from the old to the new has been seen by men like Bishop Frank Thorne, with more than 50 years' service in Africa. The body and blood of Jesus Christ, the sacrament of the bread and wine, beginning 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, taken by Jews to Rome, taken by Romans through Europe, taken by Europeans to Africa. The chain of events is almost as improbable, as mysterious, as the sacrament itself.
Jina la Bwana lihimidiwe. Msaada wetu katika jina la Bwana. Aliyezifanya mbingu na nchi. Akubarikini Mungu Mwenyezi, Baba na Mwana na Roho Mtakatifu.
For Masasi, this ceremony of many bishops is a unique event. After the celebrations, it's back to the daily routine of the parish. Richard Norgate, the parish priest, has been in Tanzania for more than 30 years. When the country became independent, he became a Tanzanian citizen. He will retire here and die here. This mission is his life. And in spite of the modern touch of the moped, his mission is precisely that of all his predecessors in the past 100 years. To maintain in Africa the gospel, the good news, which is still out here rather fresh news about the Christian God. A century ago, white men believed that Africans should imitate Christian Europe. A village much like this one was once addressed by a British colonial official. He told them, "The Queen wants you to improve yourselves and your country. We were like you long years ago, but when we learnt Christianity from the Romans, we changed and became great. We want you," he said, "to learn Christianity and follow our steps, and you too will be great." Well, no missionary today thinks in those terms, least of all Richard Norgate, who lives a life as simple as that of the people of his parish. But in one respect, his church is part of the old 19th century tradition. This is an Anglican form of service, naturally, since he's an Anglican missionary. But it's also very English. Even in Swahili, the pattern of phrase and response remains unmistakably part of Old England.
Kuangaza nyumbani kwa Mungu kwa sauti ya furaha na kusifu mkutano wa siku kuu. Mtumaini Mungu kwa amani ilikuja kumsifu. Aliye afya uso wangu, Mungu wangu.
Nafsi yangu imeinama ndani yangu, kwa hiyo ninakukumbuka.
The bell summons Christians to a special occasion in an outlying village of Richard Norgate's parish. Long ago, in Europe, when Christianity was as young as it is here in Africa, the building of a village church may well have been as simple and satisfying an event as this. For a modern missionary in Africa, constant travel is a fact of life. Once it was an achievement to establish a mission station 100 miles inland. Well, today 100 miles is a routine journey for a visit to a single village. Europe's machine bringing Europe's religion, but not this time to impose itself. The missionary in this van comes not so much to hand out Christian Europe as to give a hand to Christian Africa. She comes as much to listen as to preach. In this case, to listen to and record the music of an African village, using modern technology to help Africa develop its own African Christianity. The Church Missionary Society runs a lending library of recorded tapes for the villages of central Tanzania. The tapes are readings from the Bible, sermons, songs. The missionary has brought some tapes in a cassette player which she will leave here, but she has also come to record the people of this village singing their own Christian music, African hymns. And this new tape in its turn will be lent to other villages.
Hivi na kaseti hizi. Sawa? Maana mmeendelea sana na masomo yenu ya kaseti. Kwa hiyo tunatumaini kwamba hata wengine watajiunga na masomo ya kaseti, sivyo? Haya, asante sana.
Napenda kwenda mbinguni kuona makao. Napenda kwenda mbinguni kuona makao. Wanapiga vigelegele mbinguni kwa Mungu Baba. Wanapiga vigelegele kwa Mungu Baba. Wanapiga vigelegele mbinguni kwa Mungu Baba. Wanapiga vigelegele kwa Mungu Baba. Ndiye Mungu wa mbinguni wamsifua. Haleluya. Ndiye Mungu wa mbinguni wamsifua. Haleluya. Napenda kwenda mbinguni. Ndiye Mungu wa mbinguni wamsifua. Haleluya. Ndiye Mungu wa mbinguni wamsifua. Haleluya. Napenda kwenda mbinguni. Nasikia kuna nyimbo wanaimba sana. Nasikia kuna nyimbo wanaimba sana. Wanapiga vigelegele mbinguni kwa Mungu Baba. Wanapiga vigelegele kwa Mungu Baba. Wanapiga vigelegele.
African music and modern technology. The cassette program is the most forward-looking of the Church Missionary Society's activities. In the Missions Training Center at Umsalato, young Christians are educated to carry the faith to their own villages. But here they're taught along old and familiar English lines. The missionaries are careful to provide more than just a Christian education. They offer the basic skills required in a developing country such as Tanzania. Mrs. Townsend teaches sewing on a machine provided by communist China. Every ideology makes its missionary effort in modern Africa. For the most part, the skills taught here were familiar in Sheffield 100 years ago. Mr. Townsend gives instruction in the ancient routine of the double saw, while other students are initiated into the mysteries of baking powder.
Unaweka mle tayari, alafu unachukua hii inaitwa nini? Baking powder. Unachukua ile baking powder, tunaweka vijiko viwili tu vya chai ambavyo havikujaa sana. Kiasi hicho na kuweka pamoja. Kiasi hiki naweka pamoja.
Such skills are useful anywhere, but the real purpose of teaching them is the purpose behind all missions, spreading the Christian faith. If their skills give these young people influence in a village, that influence will be Christian. They're a practical army for a spiritual campaign. In Tabora, in the center of Tanzania, 7 out of every 10 people still believe in Africa's traditional gods. Of the others, half are Muslims, worshipping in the mosque, and half are Christian. There are Lutherans and Moravians, but most Christians here are Roman Catholics, and the center of all their activities is this colonial mansion, the house of the Archbishop, Marco Mihayo. In 1960, he became the first black Archbishop of Tabora. Archbishop Mihayo is assisted, in running his diocese, by members of the religious order which first founded a mission here, the White Fathers. The first White Fathers arrived 100 years ago, and it's been a hard struggle. The Christians are still only a small minority here in Tabora. But the missionary influence has been greater than mere numbers might suggest. For example, the president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, is a practicing Christian and once taught at a Catholic school here in Tabora. Round this table are people from Holland, Canada, England, Germany, most of whom came to Africa as young men. They came as missionaries. They came to teach. They came with the same ideals as a young white father today, Pete Smith from the north of England. Young as he is, he's already been a missionary here for nearly 10 years.
Allahu Akbar.
When Pete Smith became a white father in his early 20s, he vowed to spend his entire life serving as a priest in Africa. He specializes now in the mission to the Muslims. The original work of the White Fathers was among the Muslims of North Africa, and missionaries first came to Tanzania because of the Arab slave trade. So Pete Smith continues the oldest tradition of missionary work in Africa when he visits a leader of the Muslim community in Tabora, Sheikh Rashid. Sheikh Rashid is a learned man, and these other Muslims have come here to discuss with him passages from the Quran, the book which every Muslim must learn part of, which a holy man will hope to know by heart in its entirety, and which the White Fathers have made a point of studying, so as to be able to make better contact with the Muslims. Pete Smith is well known in the local Muslim schoolroom. He even helps sometimes in a class on the Quran. No Muslim is allowed to translate the Quran out of its original Arabic, so it's often recited without a word being understood. But a Christian like Pete Smith can turn passages into Swahili for the children without giving offense. He visits here as a friend.
Marahaba, habari za leo. Munajifunza nini? Munajifunza nini?
إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين.
إياك نعبد
Kwako ndo tunakuabudia na kwako tunaomba msaada.
Kwako ndo tunakuabudia na kwako tunaomba msaada.
The mission can be grateful to the Muslims for its coconuts. Tabora was an important slaving station, and it's said to be the Arab slavers who introduced coconuts to Africa, bringing them down from the palm-fringed oases of the Gulf. Some 70 years ago, Christian missionaries planted this particular grove, which now provides a useful source of income. The quick flap of a sack breaks the fall of each coconut and saves it from breaking its shell. The gathering of coconuts hasn't changed in 70 years, any more than the schoolroom of Muslim children. But Pete Smith himself is a very different type of missionary from those who planted the palm trees. They lived in a colonial world, in which the white man felt he had everything to teach Africa. Today it's often said that Africa's young Christianity has many lessons for Europe. When Pete Smith arrives to take a service in his strikingly modern church, the atmosphere is one which would have greatly surprised the missionaries of the old days.
Kwa jina la Baba na la Mwana na la Roho Mtakatifu. Amina. Neema ya Bwana wetu Yesu Kristo na upendo wa Mungu Baba na ushirika wa Roho Mtakatifu viwe nanyi nyote. Ndugu zangu, tujute dhambi zetu, tupate kujiweka tayari kutoa sadaka takatifu.
A specific meaning of missionary are people who leave home, leave perhaps even the culture in which they were born, and then they go out to share, to implant Christ into that other culture. And there, having implanted it, there is intellectual processes involved, but basically it is an implanting of the seed of Jesus Christ, which will then be allowed to grow and shape itself according to that, the earth in which it is sown. And perhaps this is a big difference between older missionaries and some of the younger ones now. The older missionaries came out with the message, with the envelope, with the whole full growth of Christ's message. They thought that this was the best version of it, the one that we had. Whereas it had the seed, but it also had the tree also had already grown. Now we can chop a lot of branches, a lot of the tree off the European idea of missionary. It may be suitable for us and may be right in its cultural context. But here what we must be allowed, or what we must allow, is to be prepared to plant that seed and to allow it to grow according to its own African context.
Nakaomba hakika kwa ajili yenu na kwa ajili ya wote kwa maondoleo ya dhambi. Fanya hivi kwa kunikumbuka mimi.
Salvador Ferrao is a missionary colleague of Pete Smith's, another parish priest with a parish in the suburbs of Tabora. He's a Jesuit and comes from India.
Yesu anatuita.
The sisters who help Father Ferrao in his church also work with him in the village which he and they have together created. One of the purposes here is to care for people cured of leprosy, the ancient disease which haunts the pages of the Bible. the very symbol of an outcast. 10 years ago, this place was just 2 or 3 huts, organized by Mother Teresa, who sent some of her Sisters of Charity here from Calcutta. Ferrao has built on that small beginning. Until now, the village houses 120 people, Muslims as well as Christians. And not only lepers, anyone in desperate need of charity. Its name is the Village of Peace, and its purpose, in Ferrao's own words, to let people live in peace and die with dignity.
Ameleta mikate.
Jambo mama.
Haya.
Habari gani?
Nzuri, jambo bwana. Mimi sitaki. Habari gani? Jambo.
Utanikataa mimi mwendao. Sasa hakuleta makazi. Habari za nyumbani
Hao wazee ni nani hao? Nene kwa kupiga shikamoo.
Nimekushawaamkia wote.
Hawa. Uwe katikati. Uwe katikati. Wanakimbia wote.
Wanakimbia wote. Unanikimbia namna gani? Wananipata jana.
Christians and Muslims together still account for only 3 out of every 10 people in Tanzania. There are many villages which have only recently heard of either the Bible or the Quran. In a place like this, life goes on much as it always has, in what Europe has considered its old pagan ways. Here, the message of the Christian God is distinctly strange, the peculiar concern of a small group within the village. Missionaries have taught this lay preacher, and he now passes on what he knows, reminding the Christians in the village of what their faith involves, preparing them for the day when an ordained priest will have time to visit them and will baptize the children born since his last visit. The teacher's method is one familiar to any European child who has been to a Sunday school. The repetitive routine of the catechism, with its deliberately memorable rhythm of question and answer.
Kristu, tunakumbuka Kristu alibatizwa. Alibatizwa kwenye mto gani? Mto wa? Nani aliyembatiza Yesu Kristo? Yohani Mbatizaji alimbatiza Yesu Kristo.
A young boy, born a pagan, first heard of Christianity from just such a lay preacher. From this house, he now controls the entire diocese of Tabora, of which he is the Archbishop, Archbishop Mihayo. Today he discusses with 2 of his staff the eternal problem of raising funds for the mission.
Oui, mais alors il faudra consulter la liste des quêtes qu'on a déjà faites.
From the first founding of the White Fathers, more than 100 years ago, the aim was to train African priests for the ministry. And today the principle that the African Church should be able to do without European help is generally accepted. Yet more than half the priests working in Archbishop Mihayo's diocese are still European. The problem, according to the Archbishop himself, is finding enough Africans who are either qualified or willing to enter the priesthood. The young African priests who are ordained, such as Father Kienzi, are agreed by everyone to be the future of the African Church. But for the present, Europeans are still forced into what looks much like the old pattern of colonial administration.
And his new bride, Berta Mpombwe.
I'll check, but I think it's all right.
I'll be grateful if you would.
So that's okay?
Okay.
Cheerio.
Thanks very much.
Kuanana.
Tutonana.
Pete Smith is as keen as anyone to see the African church become fully African, even if for the moment that isn't possible. But for the young African priest, Father Kienzi, and for his congregation, such problems fade away in church before the exhilarating and infectious fact that their Christian service is already unmistakably African.
Having laid the foundations of the church here in Tanzania, I think we're at the stage now where we are cooperating with the local church with a view to handing over to them completely. In other words, that we're working to do ourselves out of a job.
In the last century, Sheffield was horrified to learn that only 40% of its people went to church on a Sunday. Today, the figure is less than 10%.
In the next programme, Fatima in Portugal, where 1 million people assembled to pay homage to the Virgin Mary. Few would deny the emotional impact of a ceremony such as this. But it is precisely these emotions which offend the rational minds of many people today. The next programme looks at some of the reasons behind falling church membership and at the roots of disbelief.